The snow came sideways across the Espaola Valley the morning the developer's crew arrived to stake Elena Vargas's sunflower field for demolition, which was either very bad timing or, depending on how you looked at it later, exactly the right kind. There is a kind of woman the world mistakes for stubborn when what she actually is correct. Elena Vargas of Tierra Dulce, New Mexico, was that kind of woman, and it took a blizzard, a beekeeper's veil, a young man with a limp, and the better part of one very long winter to prove it. To the valley, to the developer, and, in the way that matters most, to herself. This is the story of Elena, a field of sunflowers, and what lives inside a thing when everyone else has stopped believing in it. If you've ever held on to something that the world told you to let go, subscribe to this channel right now, turn on the bell, and leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Elena had been a widow for 14 months when the letter from Cimarron Development arrived. She was 58, with silver-streaked hair she kept in a braid, and the kind of stillness that people who don't know grief sometimes mistake for coldness. She was not cold. She was conserving. There is a difference, and it matters. Her husband Bernardo had died of pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday in September, which was the cruelest month to die in northern New Mexico, because September in the Espaola Valley is when everything is at its most alive. The chiles hanging red in the ristras, the cottonwoods just beginning to think about turning, the sunflowers at full height along the eastern and southern edges of their 3-acre property, heavy-headed and gold, tilting slightly in the afternoon wind like a congregation that has heard something worth leaning toward. Bernardo had kept bees for 22 years. He had built the apiary himself, 6 hives along the north wall of the property, and expanded to 14 over 2 decades, and the honey, Miel Vargas, dark amber, labeled by hand, had sold at the Espaola Farmers Market every Saturday from April through October, and had a waiting list by the time he died. The bees were his, in the way that some things belong to a person not through ownership, but through the specific quality of attention they give it. Elena had helped, always. She had learned what he taught, but the bees, she had always privately felt, loved Bernardo better, and she was not sure she blamed them. The sunflowers were also Bernardo's design. He had planted the first rows 12 years ago, a specific variety, tall, pollen-rich, long-blooming, along the property's eastern and southern edges, and in 2 diagonal corridors through the center field. Elena had asked once why the corridors went diagonal instead of straight. He had spread his hands over the map he'd drawn on graph paper and said that the bees needed a flight path that connected to the Garcias' lavender field to the south and the Romeros' orchard to the north, and that a diagonal used the least land for the longest reach. She had nodded and gone back to what she was doing, and had not thought about it again until 14 months after he was gone. After Bernardo died, Elena kept the hives. She checked them the way he had taught her, slowly and without sudden movements, with his veil hanging on the porch post, because she could not yet bring herself to wear it. She harvested the fall honey in October, alone, in her own veil, a newer one, and did not open the farmer's market box of supplies that autumn, because she was not ready for the Saturday mornings, and the people who would ask about Bernardo with their faces arranged in sympathy she didn't know what to do with. She sold no honey that first year. She kept the sunflowers. She replanted in April from the seed stock Bernardo had stored in labeled mason jars in the shed, the same variety, the same corridors, the same spacing, because she did not know what else to do with the seeds, and the field looked wrong without them. The town of Tierra Dulce had opinions about this. Not cruel opinions, not to her face, anyway, but the kind that travel in the oblique language of small communities, arriving as gentle suggestions from people who meant well and landed as something heavier. Her neighbor Patrice said that perhaps sunflowers were a lot to maintain alone. The man at the feed store mentioned that the land along the highway was selling well and that Elena's parcel would be attractive to the right buyer. Father Marcos, at the parish where Bernardo had served on the landscaping committee for a decade, said during a home visit that sometimes letting go of what was his could be a form of healing. Elena thanked each of them and planted her sunflowers. The letter from Cimarron Development arrived in November. It was 2 pages, professional, and explained that the company was assembling parcels along the eastern Espaula corridor for a residential development to be called Vista Dulce Estates, that Elena's property was central to the project's southern boundary, that they were prepared to offer a price she had to admit was not insulting, and that the project timeline required a decision within 60 days. Attached was a rendering. It showed 32 townhomes where the sunflower field currently stood. Elena put the letter in the kitchen drawer and did not answer it. A man named Rogelio Cisneros came to the door 2 weeks later. He was in his 40s, in a company vest over a fleece, and he spoke with the careful warmth of someone who has been trained to speak with careful warmth. He called her Mrs. Vargas and said he understood this must be a difficult time and that the company was sensitive to that, and was there anything he could clarify about the offer. Elena said the offer was clear. He said 60 days was a firm timeline due to permitting requirements. Elena said she understood. He looked past her at the sunflower field, bare stalked now in November, the heads harvested, the stalks standing gray and dense. He said, carefully, that he imagined maintaining such an extensive planting alone must be significant work, and that perhaps the practical considerations were worth weighing alongside the sentimental ones. Elena looked at him for a moment. "My husband designed that field," she said. "I don't know everything he put into it yet. I'm not selling something I don't fully understand." Rogelio Cisneros smiled the smile of a man who has heard this before and knows how it usually ends. He left his card. He said to call any time. The young man arrived 3 days after the first snow, which was early December and a light snow. Not the blizzard that was coming, but a preview of it. He came up the road on foot, with a military-issue duffel bag, and a slight drag in his left leg that he was clearly working not to favor. He knocked on the door of the cottage and asked if she needed any winter work done. His name was Danny Trujillo. He was 29. He said he was from Chimay, that he'd been in the army for 6 years and had been back in New Mexico for 4 months and was picking up work where he could find it. He said he was good with his hands and better with animals, and that he had kept bees with his grandfather as a boy. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Can you check a hive without smoking it?" "Depends on the hive." "The right answer," she said, and opened the door wider. She gave him the small room off the shed that had been the hired man's room when Bernardo's father had run the property, which hadn't been used in 30 years and smelled of it, and which Danny cleaned himself in an afternoon and said was fine. She fed him dinner every night as part of the arrangement and paid him a daily wage she could manage if she was careful, which she was. Danny worked quietly and well. He split wood without being asked. He checked the hives with the instinct of someone who had learned young and not forgotten. Slowly, no sudden movements, reading the sound of the colony before he opened anything. He found a problem in Heave 7 that Elena had missed and corrected it before it became a crisis. He did not talk much, which she appreciated, and when he did talk, he said things that were worth hearing, which she appreciated more. One evening in mid-December, he came in from the field and stood at the kitchen door with snow on his shoulders. "Mrs. Vargas," he said, "those sunflower stalks, what about them? The bees are clustering in them." He paused. "The hollow stalks. There are wild colonies in at least 6 of them. Your husband left them standing on purpose, didn't he?" Elena turned from the stove. "He always said leave the stalks until March. For the bees. Native bees overwinter in hollow stems. Your field is a winter habitat, not just a summer one. He said it without emphasis, the way you say a thing you want someone to understand rather than be impressed by. If those stalks get cleared, or if the field gets developed, the native pollinator population for this whole corridor is going to drop hard. The Garcias' lavender, the Romeros' orchard, they depend on what winters here. Elena was quiet. Did you know that? Danny said. I'm starting to, she said. That night she went to the shelf where Bernardo kept his beekeeping notebooks, 7 of them, spiral-bound, labeled by year, and opened the oldest one. She had looked at them after he died, and found them too full of his handwriting, which had undone her, and put them back. Now she read. But that night, Elena was going to read something in those notebooks that had been waiting 11 years for her to be ready. It was in the 4th notebook, from 11 years ago, the year he planted the diagonal corridors. 3 pages of notes in his small, careful handwriting, with diagrams, with measurements, with arrows showing flight paths between the Vargas apiary and the Garcia lavender and the Romero orchard, and 2 wild hedgerows along the acequia that most people in the valley had stopped noticing. At the top of the first page he had written, Pollinator Corridor, Espaola Valley Eastern Section. This field is not decoration. It is infrastructure. Below the diagrams, a paragraph, the valley's domestic and wild bee populations in this corridor have declined 40% in 12 years based on my counts. The sunflower plantings on this property, if maintained in the current configuration, will stabilize and likely reverse that decline over a 10-year period. The diagonal corridors are not aesthetic. They are the shortest flight path connecting the 3 anchor farms. If this land is ever developed, the Garcia and Romero operations will face pollinator deficits within 2 to 3 seasons. I have not told them this because I do not want them to feel dependent on us. But it is true. And at the bottom, in different ink, added later, Elena. If you're reading this after I'm gone, and I hope you're not reading it too soon, please know that what I built here is bigger than our property. The valley needs this field. Don't let anyone tell you it's just sunflowers. Elena sat at the kitchen table with a notebook until 2 a.m. The beekeeper's veil hung on the porch post outside the window, moving slightly in the draft under the door. She went to the shed and found Bernardo's acequia map, a large sheet of drafting paper, folded to notebook size, showing every water channel in the valley's eastern section with the pollinator corridor overlaid in red ink. She brought it inside and spread it on the table next to the notebook. She called Danny from the shed in the morning. He came in and stood over the map and the notebook and read without speaking for a long time. The developer's survey stakes are at the southern boundary, he said finally. I know. If they break ground in spring, I know, Elena said. I need to show this to the Garcias and the Romeros before I respond to Cimarron. Rogelio Cisneros arrived with his survey crew on the morning of the blizzard. Elena had not expected them. The 60-day deadline was still 4 days away, but Cimarron's permitting window had moved up. Rogelio explained through the storm door, and the crew needed to finalize the southern boundary stakes before the county office closed for the holidays. He was apologetic in the way that people are apologetic when they are not actually sorry but understand that the appearance of it is useful. Elena opened the door. Behind her at the kitchen table sat Marcos Garcia, 63, who ran the lavender operation to the south. Beside him sat Dolores Romero, 70, whose orchard to the north had been in her family since her grandparents planted it, and who had driven through the first hour of the storm to be here. Between them on the table were Bernardo's notebook, the acequia map, and a folder that Elena's neighbor's son, a water rights attorney who handled acequia cases, had put together in 4 days after Elena called him. The folder documented the pollinator corridor as an agricultural dependency under New Mexico's Right to Farm statute. It included Bernardo's 11-year bee count data from the notebooks. It included a letter from the State Agriculture Extension Office, whom Danny had contacted through a Veterans Agricultural Assistance Program he knew about, confirming that the corridor configuration was consistent with documented best practices for native pollinator habitat in high desert farming communities. It included signed statements from the Garcias and the Romeros attesting to their operational dependency on the corridor. It did not, the attorney had said, guarantee anything. But it established the corridor as a documented agricultural asset which changed the conversation from sentimental to legal. Rogelio looked at the folder. He looked at the three farmers at the table. He looked at Danny, standing by the window. He looked at Elena. Outside, the blizzard had arrived in full. The real one. The kind the Espaola Valley got twice a decade, that shut the highway and buried the acequia markers and turned the whole eastern corridor white and undifferentiated and still. Through the window, the sunflower stalks were visible at the field's edge, gray and dense and standing. "Mr. Cisneros," Elena said, "your crew is welcome to stake the boundary once the storm clears and the ground is visible. In the meantime, I'd like you to look at this." She slid the folder across the table. He did not sit down, but he opened the folder and read the first page, and then the second, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when a person recalibrates without wanting to show that they are recalibrating. "This will need to go to our legal team," he said. "I expected that," Elena said. "I've asked for a 90-day extension on the offer timeline to allow for that review. That's not standard. The agricultural dependency filing is not standard either," her attorney's letter noted, which Elena pointed to quietly. "My attorney's contact information is on the last page." Rogelio closed the folder. He looked once more at the window, at the field, at the stalks, at the snow accumulating in the dense planted rows that Bernardo had spaced. Elena now understood, not only for flight paths, but for exactly this: snow fencing, wind buffering, the slow release of moisture into the acequia-fed soil through the winter and into the spring. He left the folder on the table. He said his legal team would be in touch. He and his crew did not stake the boundary that day. The ground was buried, and the stakes, when they tried to drive two of them at the road's edge before the storm worsened, would not hold in the frozen soil, which Elena noted privately with a satisfaction she did not express. The survey crew left. The storm closed the road an hour later. Elena made coffee for the Garcias and the Romeros, and they sat at the table for 2 hours in the warmth of the kitchen while the blizzard worked outside, talking about the acequia and the orchard and the lavender and the bees and Bernardo, whom all of them had known and none of them had talked about enough since he died. Danny sat at the end of the table and mostly listened, which was, Elena had learned, his way of paying the most serious kind of attention. Cimarron Development withdrew their offer in February. The agricultural dependency filing, the attorney said, made the permitting process complicated enough that the project's timeline was no longer viable. Vista Dulce Estates moved to a different parcel, further from the valley's eastern corridor, where the land was flatter and less interesting, and would be easier to build on, and would mean less to no one. The winter bees in the sunflower stalks came out in March, when Elena and Danny cut the stalks as Bernardo's notes specified, and not before. They counted 11 native bee species emerging from the hollow stems, which Danny photographed and submitted to the Extension Office, who added the data to the corridor study. Elena opened the farmer's market box in April. She labeled 43 jars of miel Vargas, the fall harvest, which had been the best in 6 years, and drove to the Saturday market in Espaola for the first time since Bernardo died. The waiting list customers came to the table one by one. Several of them had known Bernardo. Several of them cried, which made Elena cry, which she had expected and had brought extra napkins for. She wore Bernardo's beekeeper's veil to check the hives that afternoon, She had taken it from the porch post on a Tuesday morning in March, cleaned it carefully, and hung it on a hook inside the shed door where she could reach it easily. It fit. It fit the way things fit when they were made for someone the same size as you, which is not always the same as being made for you, but which is close enough when the person who it was made for is gone and the thing still needs doing. Danny stayed through spring. He said he'd stay through summer if she needed him, which she did, and through the fall harvest after that, which she also did. And at some point the question of whether he was staying stopped needing to be asked. The beekeeper's veil hung on the hook inside the shed. Next to it, on a nail, hung Bernardo's, which was where it had always hung when it wasn't in use, and which was where it would stay. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, in the place where the morning light came through first, Alina set the last jar of Bernardo's honey, the one labeled in his handwriting, the one she had not opened and would not, next to the acequia map in its new frame. Because the door that opens out of compassion, even the door a dead man built in the geometry of a sunflower field for the bees and the neighbors and the wife he knew would still be standing when the storm came, keeps opening long after the hand that built it is still. Have you ever had to let go of something you loved in order to receive what you truly needed? If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who is holding on to something the world says they should let go of, because sometimes what looks like stubbornness is just someone who knows what they're standing in. Until the next story. And they say in Tierra Dulce that on Saturday mornings from April through October, if you drive the eastern corridor toward Espaola when the sunflowers are high and the light is right, you can see the bees moving between the Vargas field and the Garcia lavender and the Romero orchard, in long gold lines that run diagonal across the valley, the way Bernardo drew them, the way Alina kept them, the way they will keep going now that the valley finally knows what they are for.